Great Plains Electronic Funds Transfer for Payables. Your host, moderator, and presenter today is David Caldwell. We're going to have an interesting time looking through the Great Plains EFT Payables module. We're going to get a look at how to set it up, essentials for information that you need in order to get it started, part of understanding what you need to collect in terms of data prior to setting up the module, setting up the vendors, all the way through the process of selecting vouchers to pay and paying them by way of electronic fund transfer. About EFT Payables, we do offer training on this module should you need additional information or either assistance with helping in getting it set up. I'd like to first start in by just a quick PowerPoint presentation slide, and I think that this would be something that you need to make sure that you consider along the way. Some considerations. The electronic fund transfer program covers both payables and receivables. Our focus today will be only on the payable side. This is specific to accounts payable. Meaning that we have some considerations that we want to pay vendors electronically. This could be either some of our vendors or either all of our vendors, depending upon what you consider policy or what your vendors will accept in terms of the form of payment. As most of the modules, as you all have well experienced, is that there's always a setup that needs to be performed before you actually can get in and begin using the feature or the module. And the electronic fund transfer program is no different than any other module. But there are some serious considerations here that we need to take in hand as part of our overall setup. And I would consider this to be called your homework. And this is something that needs to be collected, information that you need to get prior to actually going in and starting to set up the EFT module. And I'd like to go through each one of these points because they are important. The first one is, and I consider this to be very vital, and that is to communicate with your bank. This would be the bank from where your money will be transferred from to the vendors who will agree to being paid by electronic fund transfer. Now, from my experience, most banks have a technical officer somewhere located in the branch or either at the main headquarters that you will wind up talking to. But the part of the conversation that needs to be opened with the bank contact that you have is that you are currently using Dynamics Great Plains. You have the option of using, and what you're wanting to do is to set up the electronic fund transfer. Those three acronyms may not necessarily ring in their ears as to what you're talking about. So you may need to get specific with them and tell them that you're wanting to pay vendors by money transfer. They oftentimes will refer to that as NACHA or either ACH. I don't have the exact acronym descriptions for each one of those letters, but they are important and they are a familiar acronym that's used at many banks in terms of understanding a certain type of file format that is required to upload information to cause transfer of money from one account to another to occur. So if you are communicating to your bank and electronic fund transfer is not something within their nomenclature, you may want to use the acronyms of NACHA or either ACH file for upload. Now oftentimes ACH is oftentimes used when it comes to electronic depositing of payroll for employees. This is not the same format that we're talking about. This is specifically format that is for vendors. And we need to get that information, that file format from the bank. The bank has a certain file format that will contain that will allow you to format the information about who you're paying and how much you're paying and to what bank account you're routing from and to, along with routing numbers that need to be placed in a special format in a text file, what appears to be like a text file that later is uploaded to the bank by way of their website or either through a FTP, File Transfer Protocol, which is not used very often these days with many banks, or if the bank has published some sort of an application that they're asking you to use to facilitate the file upload, we still have to at least get from them the Nacho or the ACH file layout that they desire. Typically that's published in a document, and they will have a personnel there that can certainly help you interpret a lot of what you might read in this document. But it is very important to have that in front of you as you go through the setup of electronic fund transfer. The other thing that you need to discuss with them is the procedure for logging in and uploading the file. This does not need to be a conversation that takes place immediately, but it does at least sometime before you're ready to transfer payments, file information to the bank. You'll need to, at least if you're, as most banks that I've had experience with clients, you need to log into their website. Typically you're going to be assigned a user ID and password that will get you into areas within their web interface, of which will allow you to upload the file. But there will be procedures that they will at least dictate as to how they want that to happen. The other part of the conversation is what's called PreNotes. PreNotes are a safety for you, especially allowing you to test what a vendor has given you in terms of their account number and their routing information, to making sure that the data that they're giving you is accurate. And in addition to that, that the file layout that you have set up inside of Great Plains for the electronic fund transfer is also formatted appropriate to the bank. A PreNote is a test file that gets sent to the bank, uploaded to the bank, and allows the bank to look and test to see if the file is valid or if there are any changes that are required in order to validate the information that is necessary. So PreNotes are typically most of what banks want, but this is another part of the conversation that you need to have with either that technical officer or your bank contact, is about PreNote requirements. The second major thing that you need to do is also communicate with your vendors. How you do that is truly up to you, but there may be some vendors who will accept electronic fund transfer in a form of payment. Some may require it. Others may not, and still prefer to have checks sent to them that will pay them for goods and services that you bought from them. But in any event, you do have the option within the Great Plains system to either use continued classic check printing or either electronic fund transfer for those vendors who are participating in that form of payment acceptance. The next thing that you do need to get from these vendors who are willing to participate with you are their email addresses. The email addresses are important in light of there will be what is called a remittance statement that is printed out at the end of the EFT run that will get wrapped up in an email and sent to the vendor, indicating that they have been paid or should be accepting payment or expecting payment sometime very soon, and that you have released funds to pay them. And without that kind of information, there's really no other kind of communication that comes from Great Plains or typically yourself that would tell the vendor that they should be expecting payment, short of them going into their account and finding that they've been paid. So that's very important that you do get the bank account and routing information from the vendor and as well as their email address in order to submit to them a printout of their payment. The third thing is that you do need to begin to kind of replan your process for check printing and EFT. There will be a slight deviation from what you're currently doing now in terms of check printing to your vendors, to those vendors that are willing to participate in the EFT. Because Great Plains does divide up these processes into two separate types of procedures. For example, that if you do have vendors who are participating still in check printing and check acceptance, then only those vendors are paid from the beginning of the selecting of vouchers to the check prints to the posting of those checks. And in a separate batch and in a separate run, only EFT vendors are paid. So in other words, check printing and EFT is never commingled in the same check printing EFT procedures. They are treated separately by the system. So you'll need to at least do some planning as to how you go about your check printing and EFT procedures. All right, so what I'd like to do now is I'd like to jump into Great Plains and take a look around as to some of what we need to do to going through and setting up the electronic fund transfer inside of Payables. But the place that we need to start is at the financial level. Under Cards, there is a selection called EFT File Format. You're going to find this true. I'm currently using version 2013. I believe that under 2010 the EFT needed to be loaded separately. So if you're on version 2010, you may want to check back with us to making sure that you do have that software loaded, because at one time it was a separate load. Now for 2013, it's automatically loaded as part of the Great Plains installation. But under Cards, the financial menu, you're going to see what is called an EFT file format. This is probably one of the largest things that you're going to undertake when you get ready to set up the EFT. And essentially what you're doing is, this is after you've communicated with the bank. The bank has given you a set of instructions and perhaps a booklet that shows you and talks to you about how the file format should look. And that's essentially what we're doing here in this part of the system, is that we're setting up the format for that file. I have one that I've already set up that we're just going to take a look at. I'm not going to go through the process of setting up this file, but I will explain to some of the things that you really kind of need to consider along the way, especially once you begin to work at setting this up. First of all, most United States banks are working not in a comma delimited format, as many of you probably have heard when you start to talk about importing files or importing data into a system. Comma delimited is the type of format where fields of data are separated within a record. What you're going to find is that most banks are using fixed length, and essentially that's what we're doing here in this particular part of the system, is that we give a file format a name that we come up with and a description. There is a format file type that will be required, and there are several of them that are listed as you get into this. And you can see, I'll just refresh the screen here, that there are multiple type of formats that your bank is going to look for. By choosing these, we'll also set up some of the expected fields and their links of those fields in each one of the records, the header and also the footer part of the file that gets sent to them, which is required. But this kind of information is, again, what the bank will provide to you to help you in going through and getting this kind of thing set up. Let me go back to the one I have set up here. We have to determine a maximum record length. And then once we do that, is that we also then begin to determine what type of information is going to be required behind each one of the fields in each one of the records. So essentially what you're looking at is a column here that represents each one of the fields in a current record length of 94 characters. So this is getting a little technical, a little esoteric. We determine the length. We have a start and end length for each one of the fields. We have a description, and we are also mapping this to the type of data that is within each one of these fields. Okay? Now you can set up as many different file formats as you want to, perhaps you have multiple checkbooks that you may be paying EFT out of, and they may not always be with the same bank. But I think that you'll find that most banks have a standard format that they use across all checking accounts. All right. So I think this is probably going to be the toughest part of the setup that you will encounter. And again, your bank should be able to help you out with some of this. They're not necessarily going to be familiar with Great Plains, but at least they're going to be familiar enough with their file format and help coach you a little bit as you set this up. And of course, we're also available to give any kind of assistance that you may need in this area as well. All right. So that's the first and foremost thing that you need to get set up. Once you set up the file format, next we have to tie the file format to the checkbook, of which is now going to be designated as the checkbook from where EFT payments are going to originate from. Now, this does not mean that the checkbook has to be exclusively used for EFT. It could be used for checks as well. It could be a combination of EFT or checks. It doesn't have to be a brand new account. It can be a long existing account. But we do need to go back into Great Plains, even though that the checking account might have been used in past payments out of the system. We just need to add on some additional information that Great Plains will need in order to understand that this particular checkbook is EFT ready. So let's open up the checkbook. I am working with some sample data here. If you haven't guessed that already, it is the Fabricam company. I'm going to call up a checkbook here. And the checkbook that I designated is the Uptown Trust Company checkbook. All right. Now, most of what you set up in here will remain the same. I do encourage you, though, to put your bank account number here if you haven't done that already. And that's about the only thing that I might encourage you just to look at before you go to any further. But the next thing is that you'll also notice that if you haven't seen it already and you're on 2013, you should have seen this EFT bank. And this is where we're going to connect the file format that we've set up to the checkbook. So let's go ahead and go on here to EFT. All right. And essentially what we're doing is that we're giving this checkbook additional information that it did not already have when we first set up the checkbook, particularly what is going to be necessary for EFT setup. I will say that there are two major pieces of information minimally that need to be filled in on this part of the screen, and that is your routing number. And the routing number is going to come from your bank. If you don't know that already, you can also look at the MICR line on the check. Generally, it is to the left of the account number, but if you need some help with it, I would recommend getting in contact with your bank and getting a hand with what that routing number is. The next thing is that your bank account number. This is the account number that belongs to this particular checkbook. So this is also going to be very important that you have this set up. These two pieces of information are very critical. The other information that you see in here may or may not be important to your bank. And again, your booklet or your documentation that you get from the bank in terms of the file layout should help you with understanding whether or not tax registration number is important that you have here, bank company name, service class code, bank code, bank check digit. All of these might be very critical pieces of information that the bank needs to have, because this gets included as part of the file data that gets created that you'll be sending on to the bank for upload. And blocking factor, format, priority code. Some of that is also important. Now, there is help along the way, and if you hit the F1 key while you're in this screen, or even the screen that we were at a little earlier, you can open up GP Help to get a little bit of help here that might help explain some of the names of the fields here, just in case that your documentation does not have the same field name here as what they're referring to in their documentation. Okay? All right. Now, going on from there, Notice that I mentioned to you that setting up EFT could be both for payables as well as receivables, and now you see this is the button down here. I'm going to come back to communication type in just a minute, but I'm going to move on to payable options because that's where we're headed. Again, we're still in the checkbook. We're under the EFT bank maintenance setup. Work is not quite finished up yet. We're going to continue on here. All right. Now, here in the upper left-hand part of the screen, we're going to have to make some decisions. When an EFT payment is made, it makes a record inside of the checkbook, and also it also gives it a number. Now, this is something that's going to be a recognizable number by the bank, and also when you get ready to do your bank reconciliation, you'll be able to see these numbers also pop up, as well as the clearance of those EFTs have made their way through your bank account. You have the option of either using check numbers or having the system automatically generate a number for you. Now, out of the box, the system has one that's already set up, which is, as you can see there, EFT, series of zeros, and it starts at 1. You could use check numbers, but I would encourage you not to use that, mainly because if you're using pre-printed checks, that's going to throw your checkbook numbering off in your system. But it's your choice. The next thing is over here to the right is what format, that is the EFT format that we're going to use along with this checkbook for EFT. This points back to the EFT format that I was showing you just a little earlier. It's the only one that I had set up out there. There it is. And we're going to use one single format. We could vary formats based on the vendor types. And when we get into setting up the vendor accounts and routing numbers, we can designate whether or not this is a business account, a corporate account, or personal account, or foreign account. So the vendor can have, we can set up a special format for specific vendors if their bank requires additional special formatting when they receive payment notification from your bank. We'll use a single format. That's typically the case. All right. Next thing is under EFT Payable Options, whether or not your bank requires PreNotes, and if they do, and most banks do, a PreNote grace period could also be checked here in terms of the number of days, meaning that if you have payments that you're generating out of the system quite rapidly, you send PreNotes to the bank on new vendors that you are setting up, wanting to check to making sure that their routing number and account number is correct. You may want a series of days to go by before you can pay that vendor. Once you hear back from the bank, perhaps it might take 1 or 2 days for the bank to get back to let you know. I can't say with certainty how long that period normally lasts. Most banks are fairly immediate in terms of telling you whether or not a certain vendor routing number or account number is incorrect. Down here is the output files. This is particularly when we're getting ready to generate our EFTs. The files that get created, or that is the file of all the vendors and how much they're being paid, to whom is being paid to, are going to be created in a pre-designated location. So the system breaks up domestic payments against foreign payments against PreNote files. Most of you are going to be dealing with domestic payments as to foreign payments. If you are dealing with an international bank or dealing with international customers, some of the format that you set up for those customers may vary, but their files really should go into a different location so that they can be kept separately from the normal U.S. customers when it comes to generating your EFTs. The location where these files get placed are critical. Should not be someplace where everyone in the network has access to them. It should be a protected location. So my recommendation would be for you to get in contact with your IT group Tell them that you have some files that are going to be generated of which you're later going to be uploading to the bank, and that they should be in a protected folder and that only certain designated people should have access to them. All right. Then the next thing is this button here called Generate PreNotes. This is where we would come to generate PreNotes on vendors that we first set up who are going to participate in the electronic fund transfer, or any other new vendors that we may set up after we're underway, whereby we need to generate PreNotes and send them to the bank. This is where we go to do this. We'll close this and begin our back out of setting up the checkbook. So this is the second out of the major milestones that we have to go through in terms of setting up electronic fund transfer, but this is at the checkbook level. Our next stop will be at the vendor level. All right, so our next step is to go to the purchasing side, and our next stop is at the vendor level. We're going to open up a vendor, and I'm going to be dealing with a couple of vendors here that will be our sample vendors. One is the Ace Travel Company, and the other is Advanced Office Systems. Now, either one of these vendors could be vendors that you've been paying traditionally with a check, and they've now agreed that they're willing to accept a electronic fund transfer from you in lieu of a check. So even regardless whether or not the vendor is an old vendor or whether or not it's a brand new vendor you're setting up, you can certainly set them up for EFT. Now, critical thing here about this, remember that we now have this new field, and I believe is as of 2010 Great Plains, is this remit to field. So for those of you who have multiple addresses for vendors, you have no doubt made sure that the address that is at the remit to field here in the vendor record is pointing to the appropriate address to where the check is going to be sent to. This is important for EFT as well, because the remit to for an EFT will follow the same address as what you have here at the remit to. If you have vendors that only have a single address and you're using primary as the address ID for those vendors, then most likely you'll see under the purchase, remit to, ship from, and 1099 as all being primary. But for those of you who have multiple addresses on vendors, you'll want to make sure that you've identified the appropriate address for the remit to, because this is the one that EFT is going to use. Now, my next step here is to drill down on the remit to address. In this case, it was just simply called remit to. And we're looking at the Ace Travel Company, but this is where all the checks are going to wind up going to, or where they have been going to. There's a couple of things that we need to visit in this screen. One, you'll notice that there is an EFT button here. And this button is critical that you get this filled out, otherwise you won't be successful in paying this vendor. So let's walk in here. And what you're going to see here is some similar types of information that we filled in for ourselves when it comes to the checkbook from where EFT was being paid out of. But this is also a place where we're identifying the specifically and most importantly, but not exclusively, the transit routing number and the bank account number for that vendor. These are two mandatory fields that we have, at least from that vendor, that will at least help us make sure that the payment gets to that vendor. Now, the other thing is that we also have some additional fields here, some of which are grayed out, and I just checked the box for additional information. You can see those fields lit up. And then we have some other fields over here that are important. The account type, which is checking, savings, ledger, loan, payment, whatever it may be, you can send a payment to a recipient. A recipient vendor does not have to be just an individual. It can be a company of some kind. It could be any kind of organization. The other thing that you see here is a termination date. So you can put a termination date here if the vendor is no longer going to participate, or you want the system to automatically stop paying them EFT. There's a termination date. There's also an inactive box here that you can stop the EFT functionality on a vendor. Minimally, routing number and account number. I think the conversation with the vendor from whom you're going to pay, or to whom you're going to pay, you may want to have them check with their bank to see if there's any kind of special formatting in the file that they're going to be getting, their bank will be getting, that is required. If that's a tough conversation for the vendor to have with their bank, which again, what you can do is just ask them for the routing number and the account number. The PreNote process will flush that out whether or not there are any other pieces of additional information that a certain vendor bank requires that you must include in the file that you transfer. So that conversation can go in that direction as well. All right. So once you have this set up and have that in place, we've now returned back to the vendor address maintenance. We're still at the remit to address. But our next place is that there is an icon here where it says Internet addresses between the magnifier and the mapping icon. But you're going to want to click on that button, and then this is where you're going to supply the email address belonging to this vendor. This is going to ensure you the ability of being able to take the remittance statement instead of you having to print it out or wrapping up in an email and sending it to a vendor, to automate that part of the process. So this email address is going to be important that you have in place. All right. We'll go ahead and get out of the vendor EFT setup. Again, this is real critical information to making sure that the vendors who are going to participate with you have this information. Now, generating PreNotes after you have that set up, we're going to go back to the financial system real quick. So once you have that, the next thing, and again, this may be a requirement of your bank or it may not be, but you're going to go back to the checkbook that you set up and go into EFT, Payables, and then ask to generate PreNotes. Okay? So when you ask to generate PreNotes, it'll ask you what checkbook. We'll identify the checkbook. All right, will this be for both customers and vendors? Well, in this case, in my case, it will be vendors. Okay, PreNote format. This is falling back on the format that you were introduced to as we got started. It also is giving you an opportunity to send PreNotes for anyone who may have been prenoted prior. So again, you're going to have a series of vendors that you'll set up initially who are willing to participate in the EFT payment process. You'll come in here and prenote them without regard to any date on or before, and you'll process it. Where this date is important is especially if you have new vendors that have been added who are wanting to participate EFT after you're underway, and that you want to prenote them, but perhaps you want to also include any other vendors that you prenoted earlier on a certain date or before. And that's where this date would come through at. So I'm going to put in a date here. This is going to be an old date just to kind of prove a point. Okay, and we'll process. Okay, so as PreNotes will be created for all vendors that have PreNotes generated prior to 1/1/2001. Are you sure you want to recreate the PreNotes? Yes. And it will also create any PreNote file for a vendor that may have been added just recently. And you can see that this followed the path that I had already pre-designated here to placing the file. The file is being called Vendor PreNotes Uptown Trust. Uptown Trust was the name of the checkbook. And then also it come up with a series of characters to make every PreNote file that it generates unique. So we've prenoted. And let me close a couple of windows here, and I will show you what that PreNote file looks like. I set up three different file formats, PreNotes, foreign file folders, and EFT files, which would be representative of the U.S. bank concerns. PreNote. Here is today's PreNotes, and I'll open this up, and there we are. Is the PreNotes. That would be what we would select to upload to the bank. There is no monetary information in here. It is only just checking out data to making sure that what we're sending them is correct. The bank will take this file after you've uploaded it to them, and depending upon what their response time is, we'll eventually get back in touch with you to let you know whether or not the PreNotes were accepted or whether or not you have some changes that are necessary. Right? So let's go back to Great Plains. And now, one other thing that I do want to mention here along the way. I'm going to go back into my vendor, and there is an email button where you will see also here, and this is particularly something that you'll want to come in and visit on each one of your vendors when it comes to enabling sending the vendor the remittance statement at the end of the EFT creation. In other words, this is your way of communicating to them that they are going to be expecting an EFT payment in their bank account. So we're going to check vendor remittance. We've set up what's called a message ID called remittance, and the file format of the remittance statement is going to be in a PDF format. You can see that there's multiple formats that we can send to the vendor. But this is also the same place where we have the ability of sending purchase orders by way of email as well. We'll send the documents as attachments. We can send multiple attachments per email. That will allow us to do that as well. Where this is set up as far as the message IDs are concerned, real quick, I'm going to go to that. It's under Microsoft Dynamics, Tools, Setup, Company. You may want to jot this down, everybody, and Email Message Setup. And this is asking me to log on to my server here real quick, and I'm going to do this. You will get this message. And by the way, in order for the emailing to work, you do have to be using a MAPI compliant email service. But here's where I set up the message ID. And essentially what I do is that I'm setting up the what's going to be in the body of the email that's sent along with the attachment. Here's the subject. And in a brief description, this says, "Hello, attached is your remittance from our most recent check run." This could be EFT run. Please review the remittance for accuracy. If you have any questions, please contact us, Fabricom Payables Department. All right? And this is where we would go to set that up. This ties back to where we were at the vendor record and email and identifying the message ID that's going to get as made as part of the email to the vendor. Okay. All right. Now, what we're going to do is that we're going to go ahead and put a couple of transactions in and then go through the payment process so that you can see how this works. So I will say this is that as far as entering in your vouchers into the system, that process will not change because you've made a vendor as an EFT vendor. That will remain the same in terms of your data entry. Now what I'm going to do, just because is I'm going to, instead of committing to batch, I'm going to put in a couple of payables in real time and post them one right after another. We'll go through here and do this. I'll identify the vendor, and those two vendors that I mentioned to you earlier are set up for EFT. And again, this process is really no different than what you would normally go through in getting vouchers into the system. So I'll make this one $1,000. I'll check my distributions. Distributions are according to the way I want, and now I'm just going to post the payable. Normally it would get committed to a batch, I think, for most of you. We'll do this as quickly as we can. All right, so I'm going to put another voucher in, and this is going to be for a different vendor in this case, and it's going to be for Advanced Office Systems. They are in like kind are set up for EFT, and we will Put in a $3,000 invoice for them. We'll check the distributions. Okay, we're all set with that, and I will post. All right, I'm going to close this window to complete the posting process. All right, now our next step is to begin the payment process. And here's where things begin to change just a little bit for you. Now, many of you may have a different entry point as to where you go through and begin your check printing, or in this case will be EFT payment process. Some of you go into selecting checks. You set up a batch, you put in restrictions, and then you go into edit check batch to either select or deselect the vouchers that were part of your restrictions that you placed. Some of you go through that process. Others might go through the process of going just directly to edit check batch and setting up a batch here and getting a full frontal view of all the vouchers that are to be paid, and then make your selections accordingly. That process that you go through will not change. So please understand that. The selection process and your entry point, as you've done in the past, will not change. What will change is the batch that you create. So regardless of whether or not you're selecting or whether or not you're editing the payables check batch, if that's your entry point, that part will change. And I want you to make sure you make a note of this. I'm going to create a batch. I'm going to tab off of that, and I'm going to add the batch. Now, you should have all seen this by now, as you have an option of check payment method or either EFT. Remember, I said earlier is that you're going to have to replan the way in which you are going to go through your payment procedure, because checks and EFTs cannot be commingled together. They have to be done separately from one another. You'll do a check run, you can do an EFT run, but you can't do both a check and EFT run at the same time. In this case, I'm going to do an EFT run. I'm verifying posting date, checking date. Most importantly, I have to identify the checkbook that I've set up for EFT. All right? But this is a critical part right here. Otherwise, if it was a check, I could pay vendors, even though that they might be EFT, they could be paid by check. Now, not conversely. I cannot pay a vendor who's not been set up for EFT and pay them by way of EFT. They can only be paid by check. All right, so let's go into transactions, and I'm going to go into edit payables check batch. And we see Ace Travel is here. I'm going to select Ace Travel as being one of the vouchers I'm going to pay. I'm going to go down here to advanced. You remember the $3,000 voucher? I'll pay them as well. All right, now that I've gone through and I've selected my vouchers to pay, my next step is to now go to the next step, which is now the check printing process. You may have a few other procedures along the way, such as printing out what you've selected. Perhaps you might have some authorization that you need to go through before you actually do the check printing process. Perhaps there's someone else that has been doing the check printing process. Division of responsibilities, not sure, but our next step in any event is to process or make those payments. Now, you'll notice here is that checks are not an option. This is because we've chosen the batch and made the batch an EFT batch. The only thing that we have to verify is what they're referring to as the check date, which you can call the EFT date, and the posting date. And what we do want to do is we want a separate remittance. Once we've verified that, you can see the batch totals of 4,000. I'm going to process. The next thing that comes up on the screen is saying, where do you want the remittance to go? Do you want the remittance alignment form to be printed out? Do you want the remittances to be printed? Or do you just want to post? In this case, what we're going to do is that we're going to print the remittance form. I can print the remittance form, a copy for my purposes if I care to, as well as send one to the recipient, that is the vendor, or not. And in this case, what I'm going to do is that I'm just going to have it sent to the recipient. I don't need to have a copy, but I do have that ability to being able to do that. So once I have that, I'm going to hit process. There will be an exception report that is printed that tells you whether or not there were any problems with getting the vendors sent a remittance statement. So let's see if we do have any issues there. And looking for an exception report. All right, here's our exception report. And also, here's the remittance that was sent to me as the vendor. Remember, I used my own email address for the vendor. So let's open this up real quick since we've got the email in front of us. Vendor just got this. I happen to be the vendor. Okay, and in this case, on this particular vendor, I chose to not have an attachment, but rather have the vendor receive it as content here. On the other vendor, I was expecting to see that one as well come up, and I'm not sure why he's not come up, but it would have been an attachment in a PDF indicating that they have been paid. But you can see that that Advanced was sent a document successfully. So I'm not sure what happened to my other one out there, but again, in the interest of time and trying to finish, we'll not worry about that right now. I'm going to post, which is my next step. So again, we're going to go through the normal posting process just like we would any other type of posting checks, but these are going to be our remittances. So all of these reports, if you're inclined to printing them out, please do so, but otherwise what I'm going to do is I'm going to just kind of cancel through these real quick just to finish up the posting process, and it will post those records. All right, and then I have one final thing that I need to do is to generate the EFT file, because at the end of the EFT run, the file is not automatically created. I need to actually create that file. So I'm coming in here to generate EFT. Uptown Trust is the name. There is my batch right here. And here are the two that should be paid and should be found into the EFT file that is generated for the bank, of which I'm going to later upload. But I do have to generate this EFT file. So I'll hit Generate. And it says that it has created the file and it has placed it in the pre-designated location. Here's the name of the file. It's called Payment Uptown Trust, and the file, a portion of the file name increments as each time a new file is created. Now, what we'll do here, because we are completed with EFT, short of sending it to the bank, let's just go out here and check to see if that file was created, because this is where I need to get that file. Here it is on the 18th. Let's open that up, and here are the two vendors that are paid. Here's the file format that the bank is expecting to see this in. It's hard to kind of wade through all these numbers and zeros, but this is an example of the file format that this particular bank needs in order to process these payments and route and transfer money from my account to the vendors that I've designated to pay. The EFT payment process has now been completed. Well, again, I think if you were to kind of look at the beginning and all the way to the end of going through the payment process, that you'll have to say that the setup is probably the most involved, and it is something that you do need to get your bank involved with to helping you set up the file, or either us, or perhaps you might be able to get it set up on your own without any issues. But you do have the PreNote feature that allows you to do some testing with the bank to making sure that the file layout that you believe is what they're looking for is acceptable without causing any sort of monetary transactions going through your bank or any voiding of any kind. Yeah. All right. So voiding an EFT does not get rid of the file that was generated. You will have to get rid of the file that was generated if you find that there was an error. The way in which you will back out or void the EFTs is no different than what you would if it were a check. But what will be most important is that if it were one that you found as a void and all the rest were good, perhaps you may want to send the file on to the bank anyway and tell them that you need to negate one of the records that's in the file, or perhaps destroy the file altogether, void all the other EFTs that were created by way of voiding, and then start the EFT payment process again. Well, all right. Well, I appreciate you coming to today's webinar. I hope it was informative. And again, you know, we're certainly a source of information and a source of guidance. We'd be happy to help you out any way we can to help you get your EFT set up, or if any planning that needs to be done. Please let us know, and please have a great wintry day.